Have you ever slipped into sleep with a rosary wrapped around your fingers, those sacred beads pressed against your palm as consciousness drifts away? Perhaps you've done this in moments of deep spiritual hunger, or during times of inexplicable fear, or simply as a habit passed down through generations. You lie there in the darkness, the weight of the day slowly lifting, your breathing becoming rhythmic as the boundary between wakefulness and dreams begins to blur. But something feels different when the rosary accompanies you into that mysterious realm of sleep. There's a subtle shift in the atmosphere around you, isn't there? A sense that you're not alone, that something profound is unfolding in realms beyond your conscious awareness. You might wonder if this is mere sentimentality, a comfort born of familiar ritual and nothing more. But what if there's something deeper happening in that sacred space between consciousness and unconsciousness? What if, as Saint Ignatius of Loyola might suggest, when you sleep with the rosary in hand, you're actually participating in a profound spiritual exchange that transcends ordinary understanding? Many of us approach prayer with a utilitarian mindset. We pray when we need something, when life has thrown us into chaos, when our hearts are breaking, or when gratitude overflows. Prayer becomes a transaction, a momentary connection that we engage with, and then set aside until the next need arises. We compartmentalize our spiritual lives, separating prayer from the rest of our existence, as if it were simply another task on our daily checklist. But the rosary in your sleeping hand represents something radically different, something that challenges our modern understanding of how prayer actually functions in the economy of grace. When Ignatius of Loyola was recovering from a devastating cannonball injury that shattered his leg during battle, he experienced a profound conversion. Lying in bed for months with nothing but the lives of saints and Christ to read, he noticed something remarkable happening within his soul. When he imagined worldly honors and romantic conquests, he felt an initial excitement that quickly faded to emptiness. But when he imagined following in the footsteps of saints, serving Christ with the same courage he had once reserved for military glory, he experienced a lasting joy that persisted long after his daydreams ended. This observation became the foundation of his understanding of discernment, the ability to recognize the movements of different spirits within us. This same principle applies when you sleep with the rosary. The conscious decision to keep the rosary in your hand as you drift into sleep is an invitation for continuous prayer, a recognition that your relationship with the divine transcends the boundaries of conscious thought. It creates what Ignatius would call a disposition of the soul, a readiness to receive grace, even when your conscious mind has surrendered to sleep. In Ignatian spirituality, we understand that God works within us in all states of being, not just during our waking prayers or conscious devotions. Think about how different this is from our usual approach to spiritual practices. We often believe that prayer requires our full attention, our deliberate focus, our wakeful participation. We imagine that unless we're actively engaging our thoughts in prayer, unless we're reciting the words with awareness and intention, the connection is somehow broken or diminished. But Ignatius understood something more profound about human nature and divine communication. He recognized that God often speaks most clearly in the quietest spaces of our being, in the moments when our constant internal chatter and self-preoccupation subsides. Sleep with a rosary is not about earning spiritual brownie points or fulfilling a religious obligation. It's about creating a continuous thread of connection that extends beyond your waking awareness. It's a physical manifestation of St. Paul's instruction to pray without ceasing, a way of allowing your spiritual intention to continue even as your conscious mind rests. The rosary in your sleeping hand becomes a bridge between worlds, connecting your vulnerable, unconscious self to the protecting presence of divine love. I want to pause here and connect with you more personally. Have you ever experienced moments where you felt spiritually protected during sleep? That sense that something or someone was watching over you in your most vulnerable state. This feeling isn't just psychological comfort. It speaks to a deeper reality about our spiritual nature. If you've had experiences like this, whether with the rosary or through another form of nighttime prayer, I invite you to share in the comments with the words, "I've felt that protection." Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to recognize the subtle spiritual movements in their own life. Sometimes the most profound confirmations of faith come through knowing that others have walked the same path and felt the same mysterious presence guiding them through the darkness. When we examine the theological underpinnings of what happens when you sleep with the rosary, we must first acknowledge a fundamental truth that permeates Ignatian spirituality. God is always at work within us. This concept, expressed in Ignatius's principle of finding God in all things, revolutionizes how we understand prayer and spiritual connection. Prayer isn't just something we do. It's a relationship we enter into. And like all genuine relationships, it doesn't cease to exist when our attention turns elsewhere. Think about someone you deeply love. Your connection to them doesn't disappear when you're not actively thinking about them. The bond remains, operating beneath the surface of conscious awareness, influencing how you move through the world. In a similar but infinitely deeper way, your connection with God continues whether you're consciously engaging with it or not. The Rosary in your sleeping hand serves as what theologians might call a sacramental, a physical sign, an instrument of this ongoing relationship. There's a beautiful paradox here that Ignatius would appreciate. In sleep, we experience perhaps our most profound surrender of control. We cannot manage our thoughts, direct our attention, or protect ourselves through vigilance. We are, in many ways, at our most vulnerable and receptive. And it's precisely in this state of complete surrender that certain spiritual realities can unfold more freely than during our waking hours. When your defenses are down, when your carefully constructed identity momentarily dissolves, when you're not actively trying to control the narrative of your life, something opens within you, creating space for a different kind of encounter. Ignatius understood this principle deeply. In his spiritual exercises, he frequently encourages what he calls application of the senses, a form of prayer where you imaginatively engage all your senses in contemplating sacred scenes. This approach recognizes that spiritual experiences aren't merely intellectual, but involve our entire being, including the subconscious and somatic dimensions that sleep with a rosary engages. The contemporary understanding of sleep reveals that far from being a passive state, our sleeping minds are actively processing, healing, and integrating our experiences. Neuroscientists have discovered that during sleep, particularly during REM cycles, our brains are consolidating memories, processing emotional experiences, and making connections that elude us during wakefulness. When we view this scientific reality through an Ignatian lens, we can recognize sleep as a privileged time for spiritual integration as well. Consider the testimony of Saint Thérèse of Lisieux, the little flower, who once wrote about falling asleep during prayer. I think that the Holy Spirit speaks in the name of poor little creatures who fall asleep during meditation. For how often have I not been consoled by seeing that when I believed that I had not been praying at all, I had been praying well. Thérèse recognized what many saints before and after her discovered, that God works within us, even when we're not consciously cooperating. Mother Teresa of Calcutta famously slept with her rosary wrapped around her hand. When asked about this practice, she explained that it helped her begin each day with Mary and end each day with Mary. This simple explanation reveals a profound understanding of spiritual continuity. By sleeping with her rosary, Mother Teresa wasn't just bookending her day with Marian devotion. She was creating an unbroken circle of spiritual communion that encompassed both wakefulness and sleep. This continuity is central to understanding what happens when you sleep with the rosary. From an Ignatian perspective, this practice helps integrate your spiritual life with every dimension of your existence. It breaks down the artificial compartmentalization that often separates our prayer life from the rest of our lived experience. It acknowledges that we are spiritual beings even when we're not consciously engaging in spiritual practices. The Ignatian approach to sleeping with a rosary also connects to his teaching about preparation of the soul. Ignatius believed that certain practices and dispositions could prepare our souls to receive grace more fully. He didn't believe we could manipulate or control God's action within us, but he understood that we could become more receptive, more attuned to the subtle movements of the Spirit. Sleeping with a rosary can be understood as just such a preparation, a way of orienting your entire being, conscious and unconscious, toward divine encounter. There's a story about Ignatius that illustrates this principle. During his time at the University of Paris, he would sometimes become so absorbed in prayer that he would forget to attend to his studies. To balance his commitments, he began placing a statue of the Virgin Mary on his desk while studying. This wasn't superstition or magical thinking. Rather, it was a physical reminder of the spiritual dimension of his scholarly work, a way of integrating his devotion with his academic pursuits. Similarly, the rosary in your sleeping hand serves as a physical anchor for spiritual awareness that extends beyond conscious control. Let's explore the practical and spiritual methods that Ignatius offers for deepening this nighttime devotion. Ignatian spirituality is profoundly incarnational, recognizing that our physical bodies and material reality are not obstacles to spiritual growth, but vehicles for it. This perspective transforms how we understand a practice like sleeping with a rosary, revealing dimensions that might otherwise remain hidden. One of Ignatius's most valuable contributions to Christian spirituality is the exam, a reflective prayer practiced at the end of the day. The traditional exam involves reviewing your day in God's presence, giving thanks, noticing where God was present, acknowledging failures, and looking forward to the next day with hope. This practice creates the perfect prelude to sleeping with a rosary, because it establishes a contemplative mindset as you transition into sleep. Imagine concluding your day with the exam, and then deliberately taking your rosary in hand as you prepare for sleep. You're not just performing two separate devotional acts. You're creating a spiritual continuum that extends from conscious reflection into the mystery of sleep. The exam helps clear away the mental and emotional debris that might block deeper awareness, while the rosary provides a tactile anchor for your spiritual intention as consciousness fades. Ignatius frequently employed what he called composition of place in his prayer methods. This involves using your imagination to place yourself within a sacred scene. Before falling asleep with your rosary, you might imagine yourself resting in Mary's presence, or visualize being in the upper room with the disciples, or picture yourself lying near Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane. This Ignatian technique creates a spiritual context for your sleep, influencing not just your final waking thoughts, but potentially the symbolic landscape of your dreams. There's a powerful anecdote from Ignatius's life that illuminates this practice. During his time at Manresa, where he lived in a cave doing intense spiritual work, Ignatius often experienced vivid dreams and visions. One night, he saw an image that he described as something white from which rays were coming, which filled him with extraordinary consolation. Later, he came to understand this as a vision of Christ. What's significant is that Ignatius didn't dismiss these sleep experiences as meaningless, but recognized them as another avenue through which God could communicate with him. Similarly, when you sleep with a rosary, you're creating conditions that invite spiritual communication through channels that transcend ordinary awareness. The physical connection to the rosary serves as what Ignatius might call an exterior help to interior devotion. Just as he recognized that sacred images, music, and environments could dispose a person toward deeper prayer, the tactile presence of the rosary during sleep can dispose your soul toward receiving grace in this vulnerable state. It's important to understand that from an Ignatian perspective, sleeping with a rosary isn't about manipulating spiritual realities or guaranteeing certain outcomes. Ignatius was deeply suspicious of spiritual practices motivated primarily by fear or superstition. Rather, this devotion should flow from love and trust, from a desire for continuous communion rather than magical protection. The rosary in your sleeping hand doesn't function like a spiritual security system, but as a sign of loving surrender and ongoing relationship. This distinction matters because it transforms how we understand what's happening spiritually during sleep. If you approach the practice with the mindset that the rosary is a talisman that automatically wards off evil, you're missing the deeper reality that Ignatius would emphasize. The protection and grace that flow during sleep come not from the physical object itself, but from the relationship it signifies and the disposition it creates within your soul. Saint Teresa of Avila, who lived shortly after Ignatius and shared many of his spiritual insights, wrote about how the soul continues its journey even during sleep. She described how certain souls, deeply united with God, continue to receive divine communications during sleep that strengthen and transform them. While she wasn't specifically addressing sleeping with a rosary, her observations aligned perfectly with the Ignatian understanding of how God works within us beyond conscious awareness. Ignatius would likely compare sleeping with a rosary to what happens in the lives of close friends who have developed such deep familiarity that they can communicate without words. After years of friendship, a simple glance or gesture conveys meanings that would require long explanations between strangers. Similarly, the soul that has cultivated an ongoing relationship with God and Mary through rosary devotion develops a kind of spiritual shorthand, a deeper capacity for communion that continues even in sleep. We can also understand this practice through Ignatius's concept of spiritual consolation and desolation. He described consolation as an interior movement that draws the soul toward God, filling it with love, peace, and hope. Desolation, by contrast, moves the soul away from God, filling it with confusion, agitation, or despair. Sleeping with a rosary can serve as a subtle anchor during periods of spiritual desolation, providing a physical reminder of connection even when emotional or spiritual dryness makes God seem distant. There's a powerful story about a Jesuit missionary in feudal Japan who was imprisoned for his faith. Stripped of all religious objects and facing potential martyrdom, he fashioned a rosary from strands of straw on his prison floor and would hold it while sleeping. This wasn't mere sentimentality or stubborn adherence to form. It represented his understanding that this physical connection served as a conduit for grace during his most vulnerable hours, sustaining him through extraordinary hardship. Now, let's consider how this Ignatian understanding of sleeping with a rosary might transform your daily life. One of the most beautiful aspects of Ignatian spirituality is its practicality, its insistence that authentic spiritual growth should manifest in how we live and move through the world. The grace and protection experienced during sleep should bear fruit in waking life. First, this practice can gradually dissolve the artificial boundaries between your spiritual life and the rest of your existence. Many of us suffer from a compartmentalized approach to faith, where prayer and devotion occupy a separate category from work, relationships, and daily activities. By extending your prayer life into sleep through the rosary, you begin to recognize that every dimension of your experience is potentially sacred ground. Ignatius called this being a contemplative in action, someone who experiences God's presence not just during designated prayer times, but throughout all activities. Consider how your morning might differ when you've slept with the rosary. As you transition from sleep to wakefulness, the beads still wrapped around your fingers, there's a tangible reminder that you're moving within a continuous spiritual context. Rather than having to switch on your spiritual awareness after a period of disconnection, you're simply continuing an ongoing communion. This creates a different foundation for how you approach the day ahead. A woman I know who practiced this devotion for many years described how it transformed her response to being suddenly awakened in the night. Where once she would have felt disoriented and anxious when the phone rang at 3 a.m., or when a child cried out, she found herself waking with her hand already on her rosary, already in a posture of prayer. The immediate awareness of the beads against her skin would remind her that she wasn't facing whatever nighttime emergency had arisen alone. This seemingly small change had profound implications for how she handled stress and crisis. The practice also offers a powerful antidote to what Ignatius would call disordered attachments. We live in a culture of constant stimulation and distraction. Many people now sleep with their smartphones within reach, making technology the last thing they touch before sleep, and the first thing they reach for upon waking. This creates a subtle but significant statement about what we value and trust. Choosing instead to hold a rosary establishes a different priority, a different fundamental orientation. From an Ignatian perspective, sleeping with a rosary can also deepen your appreciation for the communion of saints. The rosary physically connects you to centuries of faithful believers who have prayed with these same mysteries, contemplated these same truths. As you drift into sleep, you're joining yourself not just to Mary and Christ, but to the great cloud of witnesses who have gone before you. This sense of spiritual lineage and connection can be particularly comforting during times of isolation or spiritual dryness. There's a beautiful harmony between this practice and Ignatius's teaching about finding God in all things. By bringing the rosary into your sleep, you're acknowledging that God can be found even in the unconscious dimensions of your experience, in dreams, and in the deep restoration that happens during rest. You're declaring through this simple act that no part of human experience lies outside the realm of sacred encounter. Some might wonder about potential obstacles or misunderstandings related to this practice. One common concern is whether sleeping with a rosary might trivialize the devotion, reducing a sacred object to a security blanket or good luck charm. This is a legitimate consideration, and Ignatius would certainly caution against superstitious approaches to any devotional practice. The key distinction lies in your intention and understanding. If you believe that the physical rosary itself automatically confers protection, regardless of your spiritual disposition, you're missing the deeper reality. But if you recognize the rosary as a sacramental that disposes your soul to receive grace more fully, as a physical sign of spiritual dedication and trust, then holding it during sleep becomes a profound act of faith. Another question that sometimes arises is whether there's something presumptuous about expecting divine protection during sleep, simply because you're holding a rosary. Wouldn't God protect you anyway? Ignatius would likely address this by emphasizing that devotional practices don't manipulate God's love or create obligations that bind divine action. Rather, they open us more fully to what God is already offering. The rosary in your sleeping hand doesn't compel divine protection. It helps attune your entire being to the protection that is already being extended. For those who struggle with distractions in prayer, sleeping with a rosary offers a particular grace. During conscious prayer, our minds often wander, pulling us away from presence and attention. But in sleep, as ordinary thought processes subside, there's a potential for a different quality of connection. The physical rosary continues to speak when words fail, and when conscious attention has been surrendered to sleep. Saint John of the Cross, a Carmelite mystic who lived shortly after Ignatius, wrote beautifully about how the soul continues its journey toward God even during sleep. At night, give yourself to sleep and rest in the love of God, and you will find that He guards your sleep, and that when you awake, He is still with you. Sleeping with a rosary embodies this trust that divine love continues to embrace you even as you rest. There are also practical considerations worth addressing. Some find it uncomfortable to hold an object while sleeping or worry about damaging their rosary. These are valid concerns with simple solutions. Many choose to place the rosary under their pillow or on a bedside table within reach. Others use wearable rosary bracelets that can be comfortably worn during sleep. The exterior form matters less than the interior intention. What's essential is creating that continuous thread of connection between your waking devotion and your sleeping vulnerability. As we move toward conclusion, I want to offer a vision of how this practice might gradually transform your spiritual life if embraced as part of an Ignatian approach to faith. Remember that for Ignatius, the ultimate purpose of any spiritual practice is greater union with God and greater freedom to love and serve. Sleeping with a rosary should lead toward these ends. Over time, this simple practice can help develop what spiritual writers call a habitual recollection, a background awareness of divine presence that persists throughout all activities. Just as musicians report that years of practice create a musical awareness that colors how they hear the world, years of connecting to the rosary during your most vulnerable hours can create a spiritual awareness that colors how you experience everything. Imagine developing such a deep association between the physical sensation of the rosary and the experience of spiritual safety, that the mere touch of the beads immediately centers you in trust, regardless of external circumstances. This kind of embodied faith doesn't develop overnight, but through patient repetition and grace, it becomes possible. The rosary that accompanies you into sleep becomes not just a nighttime devotion, but a lifelong anchor. There's something profoundly countercultural about this practice in our current moment. We live in an age that increasingly values only what can be measured, controlled, and consciously directed. The idea of surrendering to sleep while holding a symbol of faith represents a radical trust that runs contrary to contemporary obsessions with optimization and control. It declares that we are spiritual beings, even when we're not consciously directing spiritual thoughts. Ignatius understood that authentic spiritual growth often happens in hidden ways, beyond the reach of our awareness or control. He frequently cautioned against measuring spiritual progress solely by consolations or emotional experiences. Similarly, the grace received while sleeping with a rosary may not always be immediately perceptible. You might not wake with vivid spiritual dreams or profound insights. The fruits might manifest more subtly, in a growing sense of trust, in greater peace amid difficulty, or in a deeper capacity for seeing God's presence in ordinary moments. A friend once described to me how decades of sleeping with her rosary had shaped her approach to death. "I've practiced surrendering to sleep with Mary thousands of times," she said. "I believe that's preparing me for the final surrender." There's profound wisdom in this observation. Each night, as we release our grip on consciousness and control, we rehearse in a small way the ultimate surrender that awaits us all. Doing so with a rosary in hand connects that nightly surrender to our hope for eternal communion. If these reflections on the spiritual significance of sleeping with a rosary, according to Ignatian wisdom, have resonated with something deep within you, I invite you to join our community of spiritual seekers. Each week, we explore practices and insights from the great saints and spiritual masters that can transform our relationship with God and illuminate our path of faith. This channel is a place where we can journey together, asking difficult questions and discovering ancient wisdom that speaks to our modern hearts. By subscribing, you'll receive regular guidance on integrating contemplative practices into your daily life, finding God in all things, and developing the discernment that Saint Ignatius so beautifully modeled. You're not alone in your spiritual searching. Many of us are learning to recognize God's movements in both the dramatic and ordinary moments of our lives. Thank you for sharing this time of reflection. Your presence here today is itself a response to grace. Perhaps the most beautiful aspect of sleeping with a rosary is how it embodies the essence of faith itself. Faith has been described as trusting God beyond the boundaries of what we can control or understand. When you drift into sleep with a rosary in hand, you're physically enacting this truth. You're declaring through this simple gesture that your relationship with God transcends consciousness, that divine love holds you even when you cannot hold on to awareness. Ignatius experienced this trust profoundly during his convalescence at Loyola. Lying helpless with his shattered leg, unable to pursue the military glory he had once sought, he discovered a different kind of strength, a surrender that paradoxically empowered him. This lesson shaped his entire spiritual approach, including his understanding of sleep as sacred time. When you sleep with a rosary, you participate in this same paradox, finding strength in vulnerability, protection in surrender. The soul that sleeps with a rosary is making a quiet but powerful declaration. Even in my most vulnerable state, I choose connection over isolation. Even when I cannot consciously pray, I orient myself toward divine presence. Even when darkness surrounds me, I reach for the hand of Mary, trusting that she leads to her Son. This declaration, made night after night, gradually reshapes not just your sleep, but your entire approach to faith. Think about how many hours of your life will be spent in sleep. For most of us, it amounts to decades of existence. The decision to bring your faith into this territory, to extend your spiritual awareness into these hours through the humble medium of a rosary, represents a profound reclamation. You're essentially saying that no portion of your life lies outside the realm of spiritual significance. There's a verse from the Song of Songs that captures the essence of what happens when you sleep with a rosary. I sleep, but my heart is awake. Your conscious mind may rest, but through the rosary your heart maintains its vigilance of love. This is not a burden or an obligation, but a romance, a love that persists even in unconsciousness, a connection that transcends the limitations of awareness. As our reflection draws to a close, I invite you to consider beginning or deepening this practice tonight. Not with anxiety about doing it perfectly, not with rigid expectations about specific outcomes, but with the simple trust that characterized Ignatius's approach to spiritual life. Take the rosary in hand as you prepare for sleep, perhaps after praying the exam or a decade of the rosary. Feel the beads against your skin and recognize them as points of connection to a love that never sleeps, to a presence that watches over you in darkness as well as light. Remember that from an Ignatian perspective, what matters most is not the exterior performance, but the interior disposition. The rosary in your sleeping hand is significant primarily as an expression of trust and desire for continuous communion. It's this trust, this desire for connection, that opens channels for grace to flow during those mysterious hours when your defenses are lowered and your soul lies open. In the end, sleeping with a rosary becomes a physical enactment of a profound spiritual truth that Ignatius understood deeply. We belong to God in wholeness, not in fragments. Our relationship with the divine encompasses every dimension of our existence, conscious and unconscious, active and receptive, waking and sleeping. The beads that accompany you into sleep testify to this wholeness, this unbroken circle of belonging and love. Tonight, as you lie down to rest, consider the rosary, not just as a devotional object, but as a bridge connecting all the dimensions of your being to divine presence. Allow it to remind you that you are held in love, even as you surrender consciousness, that grace continues to work within you, even as thoughts subside. In this simple act, repeated night after night, you'll discover what Ignatius knew so well, that God can be found in all things, even in the mystery of sleep, even in the vulnerable darkness, even in the silent hours when words fail and only love remains.